Cheryl Preheim is there again in Washington outside the cathedral. Cheryl, we're all watching as the hearse is now leaving the cathedral.
Yes, the hearse just pulled out from the cathedral, making its way to Joint Base Andrews now, followed by these big vehicles you're seeing are full of the immediate family and closest friends. That motorcade will be greeted, of course, the public invited to line the street. And from my vantage point, about a half a block away, indeed, I see people bundled up in the cold get a final chance to say goodbye as the motorcade makes its final trip out of Washington, D.C. before heading back home to Georgia. You know, you all were talking about some of the messaging during the service, and I thought it was really poignant as we talk about a president who was known to bring people together in his time in the White House and in all the decades since, and it felt as though some of those messages might be directed to some of the people in the room. Let's pause as the honor guard moves forward out of the church. The blue sky against the National Cathedral is quite striking as the conclusion here to the ceremony and the services of the funeral of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. And what a remarkable service it was, starting off Joshua Carter, who started off with a story at Sunday school, which really stood out to me. It seemed like a simple story, but it had such a deep message when he said every week he would just talk about his week, meaning that he put his faith into action, and just in a week's worth of time, he would always have a lot to talk about in terms of bringing people together, diplomacy, peace treaties, working in remote places, putting feet to his faith, and then talking about that and drawing the connection between the Bible that he would teach and the work that he was doing, very important in his entire life, not just to say words, but to be a doer of those words. So seemed a very fitting way to start off as we talked throughout so many different parts of his life, through people who were significant in so many parts of his life, sharing all of the different facets of the former president. And we look at the motorcade making its way to Joint Base Andrews Air Base that will bring on special mission Flight 39 back to Georgia for the private service in planes. Steve Ford, the son of President Gerald Ford, I thought was so touching. He said honesty was a part of Jimmy Carter's very soul, and to hear his father's words, especially at this time in our country, really was very, very significant. I think just from the perspective of being here at the cathedral, I'll tell you the moment where everyone teared up and laughed simultaneously was when Jason Carter was sharing the story of Papa, who would come to the door in his short shorts and his Crocs, and when he was learning how to use his new phone and called him by accident and said, "No, I'm not calling you, I'm taking a picture." I mean, the most relatable stories and those really special moments I thought was so touching. And then to see particularly Amy and Chip Carter in those moments, just kind of tears flowing, maybe a chance to take a deep breath and take in a long week of services, just felt the family deeply in that moment, in a personal connection they all felt with a man they said was just a regular guy who happened to be in the most powerful position in the world for 4 years.
Yeah, Jason describing those as 1970 shorts. And for those of us who were wearing those shorts in the 70s, that was a very vivid image.
It was personal for you?
It was.
Brought back memories for you?
Yes.
Yeah, that was really indicative of just how much he eschewed, the trappings of wealth and status. Jimmy Carter was not about that at all. As a matter of fact, he said he had no desire ever to be rich. He did not, after his presidency, he did not take advantage of presidential opportunities to make money, to make large sums of money from speeches, and to join corporate boards where he would make lots of money that way as well. He was not interested in doing that at all. I think
and why do you think that
stands out. I think a lot of it had to do with his background, just where he came from.
But there have been a lot of presidents who have grown up without, who have morphed into these sort of regal figures. Richard Nixon grew up with very little, went to Whittier College, and he was one who became very, very regal.
Faith, his religious grounding, I think had a lot to do with how he saw the world, how he saw himself in the world. He really wanted to model his life after his Christian perspective of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was not a man about wealth and wanting to, achieve status and all of that. I think that was a large part of it.
Yeah,
he
President
really
Biden
took that to his
talked
heart.
about that as well. Like President Biden talked about visiting President Carter in 2021, going to Plains, and just how modest of a home they had. And so I think for a lot of people who got to go to Plains and see it for themselves, it really was something to say, this is the president, former president, but living in this home that they've lived in for many years.
With linoleum flooring, and the Ziploc bags hanging by the kitchen.
You would see the living room where he watched the Braves in kind of a lazy boy recliner over the summers and spring into fall, and you would look at the paneled walls around and things that were framed like Georgia maps and the kind of things that you would see in your grandparents' homes. Right. That had been framed that that really showed that they were of a different generation.
This is unheard of today. This is not the world in which we live in. All the past presidents, Gerald Ford among them, who after his tenure in the White House did in fact take advantage of opportunities that come along.
Had
with
a great home in Vail in
presidency.
Beaver Creek, Colorado, where he spent all of his summers.
Yeah, he lived a very comfortable life
in Palm
after
Springs
his
in the winter.
And he had one term as well. But Carter, this is one of the reasons why Carter stands out. Though just 4 years in office, this is a man who, still put his feet to the fire. He got up every morning. He was very, very disciplined man, disciplined long before he got into the military, but that, underscored the importance of discipline, the importance of getting up early, working hard. This was who President Carter was. He was not a showboat at all. He did the work.
And he was so multifaceted. Jeff, you talked about this over the few days that some people say he was a peanut farmer. But yes, I liked how President Biden talked about he also stood for civil rights. He was a Navy veteran, a nuclear engineer, a hardworking farmer that we mentioned, and the president too. So it was great that you also could hear all these layers of who Jimmy Carter was, and I love that was touched on today. Even though this was such a formal service, it still spoke to the humanity of a former president.
He had an insatiable appetite for learning, and whether he was learning how to be a woodworker who became the best at making furniture, or he was a tremendous fly fisherman. I hear stories about him in Habersham County with a fly rod in his hand where he was just absolutely a master.
He would practice. I've only seen, I don't know anything about fly fishing, so forgive me.
I know a little bit.
But when you twirl the I don't even know what you call it, the casting, he would practice that on his own property. There's a pond there on his land, and he would practice that. I'm understanding. And he made himself better.
That's right.
Better and better.
Or his
Just
artwork
practice.
over the Carter Center. You look at his paintings, how wonderful they are. They're tremendous. Or he found great solace in writing poetry.
He was a poet, and he spoke Spanish. And as I've come to learn, he taught himself Spanish by reading the Spanish Bible. He read a page. He said he read a page of the Spanish Bible every day in order to teach himself how to speak Spanish. So this is a man like he was a constant, never-ending learner.
I want to bring in right now 11 Alive anchor Faith Jesse, who is joining us live in D.C. from the Capitol. Faith, even though this service happened in D.C., we certainly heard several Georgia ties.
That's right, Jonathan. We're here at the Capitol. 9 a.m. We saw those cannons blast before the motorcade slowly went to the cathedral. We do want to talk about some of those Georgia ties. One of the ones that stood out to me was that beautiful rendition of Amazing Grace performed by Phyllis Adams and Layla Bolden. Phyllis Adams is a Delta flight attendant who actually met the Carters back in 2017. She was a musical guest for Carter's Human Rights Defenders Forum. As she was asked to sing at the funeral, we can all remember that beautiful, beautiful performance that she did. Speaking of the Carter Center, there are so many representatives from the Atlanta headquarters here in D.C. As Jason was talking about in his speech, the Carter Center, those in Atlanta, just a small part of so many offices across the world, but really seeing the heartbeat of it here in D.C. Speaking of Jason, he was one of two grandchildren speaking at the podium, and I would say that, I mean, his speech was very memorable because it really painted Mr. Carter as a regular old grandpa, right? Somebody who he said would answer the door in Crocs. He gave the funny story about him mistakenly dialing him on his phone, saying that, what are you talking about? I'm not trying to call you. I'm trying to take a picture, something that many of us can really relate to. And I also thought it was notable when he said, sometimes I feel like I shared my grandfather with the world. This is one of those days, but he really shared the world with me and talked about just the memories of him and his children, going with who would be their great-grandfather and all of those experiences. I also like that he said, he talked about Mr. Carter's involvement with those tiny villages, those 600-person villages that he saw as home because he grew up in a small town like Plains. Another memorable Georgia tie that we all saw was Andy Young, who was, of course, Mr. Carter's ambassador to the UN during his administration. What was so notable about that was that Mr. Young, he spoke a couple of times, but that second time, it was a chair that he sat down next to the casket as two friends, as they would be tennis partners or just having lunch, would sit down and talk. And he spoke to the audience there, the service. He talked about how a story that many of us know, that when he first met Mr. Carter, when he first heard about him, he was a little skeptical of it. He says, it's still hard for me to understand how you can get to be president from Plains, Georgia, talking about how Plains in Sumter County was one of the meanest counties for those in the civil rights movement. And he says that changed after he saw the work of Mr. Carter, how he saw his heart and his light. I believe it was a time when they were at Pascal's and he went and spoke to every single person in the kitchen through the work that they've done, and that developed. And I thought that that was so symbolic of America and the civil rights movement and the what he said, the slave and the slave owner, right? Developing that relationship and really moving forward and really displaying that unity that we saw all through the week here at the Capitol, where I am right now, that congressional service where we saw people from both sides of the aisle come together, all of Washington really pause. Really take a moment to pause to remember the life and legacy of Mr. Carter, someone who was not really political. When you talk to lawmakers that I spoke with, Jack Watson, one of his chief of staff, his second chief of staff there in his last year of the White House, saying that, you know what, Mr. Carter wasn't political. He said Miss Rosalind Carter was a little bit more political and knew the ramifications of politics, but Mr. Carter, you know, he just made the decision that he felt was right for the people. And I think that's something that we saw this week with the lines of people that first night when the gates behind me opened here for the public to come and pay their respects. The lines of people standing in those below freezing temperatures, slush on the ground. It was not comfortable outside, but they stood there, they waited, and they were patiently waiting because they wanted the moment to go in there and say their final goodbyes to someone who they knew and loved, whether they knew him in person or just knew him as president, whether they were alive during the presidency or born after he left the White House, and knew him for his humanitarian work. People were very touched by him, and I think that we saw that in that service. Of course, those in the service, family, dignitaries, people around the country coming there. It was a very emotional service inside of the cathedral, but also very emotional here on the streets, where people line the streets to see Mr. Carter and that motorcade come through. So just a beautiful service, a lot of Atlanta ties, and of course, the ultimate Georgia tie is going to be tonight when we see him take his final resting place back in his hometown of Plains.